At first glance, this looks like any turn-of-the-century family portrait. A father, a mother, 3 children. A family sitting still long enough for the shutter to close. The exposure is clean. The composition is centered. The clothing is pressed and proper. There is nothing about this image at first that would make you look twice. But look at the baby. Where its eyes should be, there's nothing. 2 pale, empty circles, not a crack in the emulsion, not water damage, not the natural decay of time. Someone pressed something sharp, a needle, a pin, the fine point of a penknife into this photograph and carved the infant's gaze out of existence. Not quickly, not carelessly, slowly, in tiny, precise circles, until only bare paper was left. Why would someone mutilate the face of their own child in a family portrait? And why was this photograph sealed inside the plaster wall of an Ohio farmhouse for over 120 years? When researchers tried to find this baby in any record, any census, any baptism register, any death certificate, they found nothing. As far as the state of Ohio is concerned, this child never existed. But this portrait is not just a picture, it's evidence. And the secret it kept hidden connects this family to one of the most quietly horrifying systems in American history. A system that swallowed children whole and made sure no one ever came looking. If you're new here and you appreciate deep dive stories like this, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Now, let me show you where this photograph was found. In October of 2021, a man named Daniel Morrow bought a condemned house at the edge of Crestfield, Ohio, for $11,000. Daniel was 41, an independent contractor, a house flipper. He bought distressed properties in small towns across the rural Midwest, stripped them down to the framing and resold them or sold the lots. He was not a historian. He was not sentimental. He was a pragmatist with a sledgehammer and a dumpster in the front yard. The Crestfield house had been vacant for at least 15 years. The roof sagged. The floors were rotted through in places. Water stains spread across the ceilings like dark continents on old maps. The county wanted it torn down. Daniel wanted the half-acre lot underneath it. But before the demolition permit could be filed, he had to strip the interior, pull out the plaster, remove the old knob and tube wiring, check the framing for salvage. On the 3rd day, his crew was pulling plaster from a second-floor hallway wall when a section of lath came loose, and something dropped out. It hit the floorboards with a dull metallic clatter and skidded into the baseboard. It was a tin box, about the size of a cigar case, corroded green at the edges, a simple hinged lid. The plaster around the space where the box had been wasn't patched. It wasn't repaired. It had been applied directly over the box, deliberately, as if the wall had been built around it. Whoever put it there didn't want it found by accident. They wanted it sealed, entombed. Inside the box were 3 things. A cabinet card photograph, stiff, about 4 inches by 6, mounted on cream-colored cardstock with a faint studio imprint along the bottom edge. A folded scrap of paper, small enough to fit in a palm, covered in handwriting. And a small bundle of pale cloth, tied closed with a length of cotton thread. Daniel untied it carefully. Inside was a lock of fine, dark hair, an infant's hair. The photograph, let me describe what Daniel was looking at. Standing at the back behind a wooden chair is a man, broad-shouldered, maybe 30 years old, wearing a dark wool suit that doesn't quite fit across the chest. Heavy mustache, hands clasped behind his back. His face is set and rigid, but that was typical. Exposure times were long. People didn't smile. Seated in the chair is a woman, mid-20s perhaps, dark dress with a high collar and leg of mutton sleeves, the fashion of 1900-1901. Her hair is pinned tightly against her skull. She's looking directly at the camera, and the expression on her face is hard to name. It's not grief exactly. It's not fear. It's something held very carefully in place, something controlled. To the left of the chair stands a boy, about 7 years old, wool jacket, short pants, one hand resting on the arm of the chair the way a photographer might have positioned him. To the right, a girl, smaller, maybe 5, holding something, a small doll or possibly a prayer book. Her face is soft and unreadable. And on the mother's lap, an infant, perhaps 6 months old, dressed in a long white christening gown that drapes over the woman's knees. The baby's face is intact, the nose, the little mouth, the round curve of the cheeks. Everything is there. Except the eyes. Two rough, pale circles, gouged into the print with something sharp. The emulsion scraped away in tiny concentric scratches until only bare, white cardstock remained. Whoever did this didn't slash the photograph. They didn't tear it. They erased the baby's gaze, patiently, precisely, as if removing the one part of the image they could no longer bear to see. Visual close-up of the folded note, faded iron gall ink, handwriting cramped and uneven. The note was harder to decipher. The ink had foxed and bled over a century of contact with the tin, but 3 fragments were legible. A date, March 1902. A phrase, given over to the Briarfield Home. And 2 words at the very bottom, underlined twice in a hand that pressed harder than the rest. God forgive. What was the Briarfield Home, and what happened there that required God's forgiveness? Daniel Morrow didn't know what any of it meant. He photographed the contents of the box, posted the images on a local history forum, the kind of place where retired teachers and amateur genealogists argue about township boundaries, and went back to pulling plaster. He almost threw the tin away. He didn't. And 6 weeks later, a woman named Helen Tierney sent him a private message that began with 11 words. I think I know who these people are, and I think I know what happened to that baby. What she uncovered over the next 3 months would reach far beyond one photograph and one family. Helen Tierney had been doing genealogical research in Hardin County for over 2 decades. She was in her early 50s, an independent genealogist, a volunteer archivist at the Hardin County Historical Society. She had traced families through fires, floods, epidemics, and wars. She had followed surnames down dead-end roads and into county courthouses that smelled like mildew and old binding glue. She was used to gaps in the record. She was used to people who disappeared. But what she found when she started looking into Daniel's photograph was something different. Not a gap, not a dead end, an erasure, deliberate and thorough. Helen started where she always started, the census. In the 1900 federal enumeration for Crestfield, Hardin County, Ohio, she found them. Walter Pardee, age 28, occupation molder, employer the Crestfield Iron Works. Clara Pardee, age 25, his wife. Thomas Pardee, age 6, their son. Nettie Pardee, age 4, their daughter. 4 people, no infant. The baby hadn't been born yet. The photograph, based on the style of the cabinet card, the cut of Clara's sleeves, and the type of studio imprint on the card's stock, was almost certainly taken in 1901, which meant the baby was born sometime between the summer of 1900 and early 1901. So Helen went looking for the child in the next census, 1910, expecting to find a family of 5. She found 4. In 1910, the Pardees are still in Crestfield. Walter is listed as a laborer general, no longer a molder. Clara is 35, Thomas is 16, Nettie is 14. There is no 3rd child, no notation of a death, no indication that a 5th member of this household had ever existed. Helen checked the 1920 census. The same, Walter and Clara, Thomas and Nettie, no one else. She checked Clara's entry in the 1930 census, filed after Walter had died. Clara is listed as a widow. Her surviving children, Thomas and Nettie, 2, only 2. It was as if the baby had simply evaporated. Helen searched the baptism records of every church within 15 miles of Crestfield. Thomas had been baptized at First Lutheran in 1894, Nettie in 1896. There was no record of a 3rd child baptized under the Pardee name, not at First Lutheran, not at any other congregation in the county. She searched the Hardin County death registers from 1900 through 1915. There was no infant Pardee listed, no child Pardee of any age. She contacted every cemetery in the county, no grave. The baby in the photograph was real. You can see the weight of it in Clara's arms. You can see the texture of the christening gown. You can see the shadow the child's body casts across her lap. This was a living infant held by its mother, photographed in a studio. It existed. But as far as every official record in the state of Ohio was concerned, this child was never born, never named, never baptized, and never died. Helen needed another perspective. She sent high-resolution scans of the photograph to Dr. Paul Amory, a specialist in 19th century photographic practices and visual culture at Ohio State University. She asked him a simple question: was there any known tradition, any cultural or religious custom from this era, that would explain why someone would deliberately scratch out a child's eyes in a family portrait? Dr. Amory's answer was measured, careful. He told her that there were folk practices in parts of Central and Southern Europe, particularly in communities with deep superstitious traditions around the evil eye, where a deceased person's image might be altered after death. The idea was to prevent the spirit from looking out through the photograph, to sever the connection between the living and the dead. But those traditions were associated with specific immigrant communities, and they were rare, almost unheard of in the rural Protestant Midwest. He offered a simpler explanation. Sometimes, he said, when a child died or was lost under deeply traumatic circumstances, the surviving parent couldn't bear to look at the image. They couldn't bring themselves to destroy the photograph entirely, but they could remove the one thing that made the image unbearable: the eyes, the gaze, the part that looked back at them. That explanation made emotional sense. Helen could feel its logic. But it still didn't answer the question she was now completely fixated on. Lost how, died how? And why, in a county that kept death records, baptism records, burial records, and census records, was there no trace? Helen went back to the note. Given over to the Briarfield Home, March 1902, God forgive. She searched the Ohio State Archives for any institution operating under that name in the early 1900s. And she found it. What she found was not a hospital, not a proper orphanage, not a licensed charity. It was something much worse, and it had operated in plain sight across 2 counties for over a decade. Before I tell you what Helen found in the Marion County archives, I want to know what you think happened to this baby. What do you think given over means? Drop your theory in the comments, because what comes next is worse than most people guess. The Briarfield Home for Dependent Children was located in Marion County, Ohio, about 30 miles southeast of Crestfield. It was founded in 1896 by a woman named Lenora Fry. On paper, it was a private charitable institution, a refuge, a haven for orphaned, abandoned, and destitute children under the age of 6. It accepted infants from across northwestern Ohio, placed there by county child welfare agents, by local pastors, and increasingly by parents who had run out of every other option. Parents who were too poor, too sick, or too broken to feed another mouth. Lenora Fry presented herself as a Christian benefactress. She gave speeches to church auxiliaries and ladies' aid societies. She published a modest annual report, 4 pages, cheaply printed, listing the names of children she claimed to have saved from destitution and placed in loving homes. She spoke of divine calling, of sacred duty. She was, by every public measure, a model of progressive-era compassion. But the Briarfield Home was funded by county governments at a rate of $2 per week, per child. And Lenora Fry had discovered something that transformed charity into commerce. The more children she took in, the more money she received, and the less she spent keeping them alive, the more she kept. Have you ever come across a story like this in your own family history? A child who just vanishes from the records? I hear from viewers about this more often than you might think. This system was not unique to Briarfield. Across the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a practice had taken root that historians now call baby farming, and it operated on a logic so simple it was almost elegant in its cruelty. Here is how it worked. A private individual, usually a woman, because the care of infants was considered women's work, would establish a home for dependent children. She would register it with the county, or sometimes not even bother. County and state governments, unwilling to fund proper public institutions, would pay a per-child subsidy for each infant or toddler placed in the home. The operator would then accept as many children as she could fit under her roof, spend as little as humanly possible on food, clothing, and medical care, and keep the difference. Children who died, and many did from malnutrition, dehydration, diarrheal disease, measles, whooping cough, pneumonia, were often buried without death certificates. Their deaths were attributed to vague causes that invited no further inquiry. Failure to thrive, infantile weakness, natural decline, or they simply weren't reported at all. Children who survived might be placed in what were called informal adoptions, handed to farming families who wanted a pair of small hands to work, not a child to raise. No court orders, no legal paperwork, no way to trace them, just a handshake and a child who would never know where they came from. And sometimes, children who had died months or even years earlier were kept on the books, their names still listed as residents, so that the per-child subsidy would continue flowing into the operator's pocket. The system thrived because it existed in a gap. Local governments didn't want to pay for real institutions. Private charity was overwhelmed and unregulated, and the children at the center of it, infants from the poorest, most desperate families in the county, had no one to speak for them. No advocates, no voice, no power. Ohio's Act of 1902 made it official. Counties were authorized to place dependent children in private homes and pay up to $2.50 per week for their maintenance. The law required no mandatory inspection, no medical reporting, no audit of how the money was spent. It was, in effect, a blank check written on the bodies of children. Lenora Fry was not trained in child care. She was not a nurse. She had no medical education of any kind. Before founding the Briarfield Home, she had operated a boarding house in the town of Marion. Her husband, Clement Fry, had died in 1893, leaving her with significant debts and a large, mostly empty property on the edge of town. The home was, from the very beginning, a financial arrangement dressed in the language of salvation. She employed a single assistant, a 17-year-old girl named Ada Bell, to help care for up to 30 children at a time. There was no physician on staff, no trained nurse, no one with any experience in infant care beyond what common sense and desperation could provide. The home's annual reports listed children as placed in good homes or returned to family, but they provided no names of the receiving families, no addresses, no dates of placement, and no follow-up, ever. Between 1896 and 1907, the Briarfield Home for Dependent Children accepted at least 140 children. Fewer than 40 can be traced to any subsequent record. To understand how the Pardee baby ended up inside those walls, Helen had to reconstruct what happened to the family in the months between the summer of 1901, when the portrait was almost certainly taken, and March of 1902, when the note says the child was given over. She found the answer in fragments, pieces of a life that fell apart quietly, the way working-class lives often did in that era, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a single injury, a single lost paycheck, and a silence where help should have been. Walter Pardee's employment record at the Crestfield Iron Works, a fragment of which survives in the company's archived payroll ledger, now held at the Hardin County Historical Society, shows regular pay entries through the fall of 1901. His last recorded payment is dated November 15th. Local newspaper archives from that winter tell the rest. The Crestfield Weekly Argus ran a brief item in December of 1901, 3 lines, buried on the second page, listing 3 men injured when a ladle of molten iron spilled during a pour at the foundry. One of the men was W. Pardee, molder, severe burns to the right arm and hand. Walter Pardee could not mold iron with one working hand. And in 1901, there was no workers' compensation in the state of Ohio, no disability insurance, no union benefit fund at the Crestfield Works. There was nothing. You were hurt, and then you were done, and whatever happened to your family after that was between you and God. Clara had 3 children under 7. She had no family in the immediate area. Helen traced her maiden name, Hollies, to a family in Seneca County, 60 miles to the east, but found no evidence of contact or support during this period. She was alone in a small town with an injured husband, 2 school-aged children, and an infant. Into this crisis stepped a man named Horace Vell. Horace Vell had been appointed by the Hardin County Board of Commissioners as its agent for dependent and neglected children. His job was to identify families in crisis and arrange placement for children who could not be adequately cared for at home. He was paid a small annual salary by the county. And crucially, he received a per-placement fee for each child he successfully delivered to an approved institution. Vell had a working relationship with Lenora Fry. Between 1899 and 1906, he placed at least 23 children from Hardin County at the Briarfield Home. He was not the only agent who fed children into that institution, but he was the most consistent. He was the pipeline. In February or early March of 1902, Horace Vell visited the Pardee household. The exact conversation that took place inside that house is lost. No transcript exists, no diary entry, no witness account. But we know the result. We know it because Clara wrote it down on a scrap of paper and sealed it inside a tin box inside a wall. Given over to the Briarfield home, March 1902. The baby didn't vanish on its own. It was taken, legally, formally, through a system that was designed to protect families like the Pardees and had been hollowed out by men like Vell and women like Fry and turned into something else entirely. Helen found the Briarfield home's surviving intake ledger in the Marion County Probate Court archives. Most of it is water-damaged. Many pages are illegible. But on a page dated March 1902, there is an entry that is still readable. Pardee Inf. Male age approx. 8 Mose Hardin Co. placed by H. Vell. In the disposition column, the column where the ledger should record what ultimately happened to the child, returned to family, adopted, transferred, deceased, there is a single mark. A dash. Nothing else, no date, no outcome, no explanation, just a thin horizontal line. The kind of mark you make when you have nothing to say or when you have decided that what happened does not need to be written down. That dash is where the official record of the Pardee baby ends. But Helen didn't stop there, because buried deeper in the Marion County archives, misfiled in a box of unrelated probate documents, she found something else, a document that was never meant to survive. In January of 1907, the Ohio Board of State Charities conducted its first and only formal inspection of the Briarfield home for dependent children. The inspection was not routine, it was not scheduled. It was triggered by a complaint filed by a physician in the town of Marion named Dr. Silas Endicott. Dr. Endicott had been called to the Briarfield home on an emergency basis to treat a child suffering from advanced pneumonia. He came. He treated the child, and he was disturbed, deeply and specifically disturbed, by what he saw inside that building. He filed a written complaint with the state. The Board of State Charities sent 2 inspectors. Their report is 9 pages long. Helen read every word, and what those pages describe is a place that had stopped being a home for children, if it ever was one, and had become something closer to a warehouse. A place where small bodies were stored, not cared for. Here is some of what the inspectors documented. 26 children under the age of 5, housed in a building with 4 usable rooms. Some of those rooms had no ventilation, no windows that opened. No running water inside the building. A single outdoor privy, shared by the children by Lenora Fry and by her one assistant, Ada Bell. Infants sleeping 2 and 3 to a wooden crib, some lying on bare straw ticking without sheets or blankets. The inspectors noted a pervasive odor of soiled bedding and unwashed skin. Food stores in the kitchen consisting almost entirely of cornmeal, lard, and tins of condensed milk. The inspectors wrote that these provisions were, and I am quoting directly from the report, insufficient in quantity and entirely deficient in nutritive value for growing children. No medical supplies of any kind, no record of physician visits, no vaccination records, no evidence that any child in the facility had been seen by a doctor at any point during their stay, with the single exception of the emergency visit by Dr. Endicott that had triggered the inspection in the first place. And then there was this. The inspectors asked Lenora Fry to account for the current whereabouts of every child listed in her intake ledger. She could not. She was unable to explain what had happened to 17 children, 17, received between 1899 and 1905. She told the inspectors that some had been placed with families, When asked for names, addresses, or dates of placement, she could provide none. She said that others had passed. When asked for death certificates, burial locations, or dates of death, she had none of those either. 17 children she could not account for. The Pardee baby, entered in March of 1902 with a dash for a disposition, was one of them. The inspection report noted one more detail. The home's rear property included what the inspectors described as a kitchen garden and an area of recently turned earth, approximately 30 feet by 12 feet, that Mrs. Fry identified as a former vegetable plot. The inspectors did not excavate it. No one ever did. Historians who later studied the Briarfield case believe that many of the unaccounted children died of disease and malnutrition, dysentery, dehydration, respiratory infection within weeks or months of their intake. The mortality rate for infants in unregulated baby farms during this period was catastrophic. Some scholars estimate between 40 and 90% in the worst institutions. The bodies were likely buried on the property, without markers, without records, without anyone being told. Other children, the older ones, the healthier ones, the ones who survived long enough to walk and speak, may have been placed in what amounted to informal labor arrangements, handed to farming families in neighboring counties who wanted cheap help in the fields or the kitchen. No court orders, no legal adoption paperwork, just a quiet transaction and a child who disappeared into someone else's household, someone else's name, someone else's life. The Pardee baby was 8 months old at intake, malnourished in a facility that could barely feed the children it already had, cared for, if that word even applies, by 2 people responsible for more than 24 infants and toddlers. That child almost certainly did not survive. But Helen could not prove it, because Lenora Fry had made sure, systematically, deliberately, over the course of 11 years, that there was nothing to prove. In March of 1908, more than a year after the inspection, the Briarfield Home for Dependent Children was finally ordered closed by the Ohio Board of State Charities. The 9 children still living inside the building were removed and placed in the county infirmary. Lenora Fry was charged with criminal neglect. Horace Vell was charged with malfeasance in office for knowingly and repeatedly placing children in an institution he had reason to believe was dangerous and unfit. Fry's trial lasted 4 days. She was convicted. She was sentenced to 2 years in the Ohio State Reformatory for Women. She served 14 months. She was released in the spring of 1910. She never operated another institution. She died in 1921. Her obituary in the Marion Star described her as a former matron of a children's home. It did not mention the trial. It did not mention the children. Horace Vell pleaded no contest to a reduced charge. He paid a fine of $75. He was not imprisoned. He continued to live in Hardin County until his death in 1929. His grave is in a well-kept cemetery with a proper headstone. Neither of them, not Fry, not Vell, was ever charged with a crime connected to the death of a specific child. Because to charge someone with causing a death, you need a death certificate. You need a name. You need a body. You need a record. And for the children of Briarfield, those records had been carefully, methodically, made not to exist. Among the Hawleys' family papers, donated to the Seneca County Historical Society in the 1970s by a descendant who was cleaning out an attic, Helen found one more thing. A letter written by Clara Pardee to her older sister, Margaret Hawleys. It is undated, but internal references, a mention of newspaper reports, a reference to Thomas's age, suggest it was written around 1908 or 1909, shortly after the Briarfield case became public. Helen held the letter in her hands. She read it in a quiet room at the Historical Society, alone in the late afternoon. Here is some of what Clara wrote. I have read what they are printing about that home. I cannot write to you what I feel. I was told he would be cared for and returned to us when Walter could work again. They said it was temporary. They said it was for the best. I went there once in the summer. They would not let me in. A woman told me through the door that the child had been placed and I should be grateful. I asked where. She closed the door. I do not know if he is alive. I think that I will never know. Helen believes it was Clara who scratched the baby's eyes out of the photograph. Not out of malice, not out of superstition, not out of madness. Out of something far more specific and far more devastating, the unbearable experience of being looked at by a child you could not protect. A child whose eyes might have closed for the last time in a room you chose to send him to. A child whose gaze, staring up from a photograph on a shelf or in a drawer, asked a question every single day that had no answer and no end. Why did you let them take me? Clara sealed the photograph, the note, and a lock of the baby's hair inside a tin box, and then she sealed the tin inside a wall. She didn't destroy the evidence of her child's existence. She entombed it, like a body she was never given the chance to bury. Walter Pardee never fully recovered the use of his right hand. He worked as a general laborer in Crestfield, odd jobs, heavy lifting, ditch work, whatever a man with one good hand could find until his death in 1923 at the age of 51. The cause listed on his death certificate is heart failure. He is buried in Crestfield Township Cemetery under a plain limestone marker. Clara lived 15 years longer. She died in 1938 at the age of 63. She is buried beside Walter. Her death certificate lists 2 surviving children, Thomas and Nettie. 2, not 3, never 3. Thomas Pardee became a railroad clerk. He lived in Kenton, Ohio, until his death in 1962. Nettie married a farmer named Elwood Greer and raised 4 children on a small property outside of Upper Sandusky. She died in 1971. Neither Thomas nor Nettie, as far as any surviving record shows, ever publicly spoke about a younger sibling. Not in letters, not in family documents, not in any conversation that was written down or remembered by their children or grandchildren. There are Pardee and Greer descendants living in Ohio today. Helen contacted 2 of them during her research. Neither had ever heard of a third child in Walter and Clara's family. Neither knew about the photograph. Neither knew about the Briarfield home. The silence Clara built, the wall she constructed around that loss, both literally and in every other sense, held for over 120 years. Visual, the tin box now resting on a clean white surface under archival lighting, the photograph beside it, the note, the lock of hair in its cloth wrapping, soft, even light, no shadows. Daniel Morrow donated the tin box and its contents to the Hardin County Historical Society in early 2022. He said he didn't feel right keeping it. He said it felt like something that belonged to someone, even if he didn't know who. Helen Tierney published a detailed account of her research in the Ohio History Journal later that year. The article was titled, "The Pardee Infant and the Briarfield Home, a case study in unregulated child placement in early 20th century Ohio." It drew modest attention, citations from a handful of academic historians, a mention in a genealogy newsletter, a few emails from researchers working on similar cases in other states. No remains have ever been recovered from the former Briarfield property. The building was demolished sometime in the 1920s. The land was sold, resold, planted, and replanted. Today it is a soybean field. No marker stands on it, no plaque, no memorial. If you drove past it on the county road, you would see nothing but flat earth and green rows stretching to the tree line. The Briarfield Home's surviving intake ledger is held in the Marion County Probate Court archives. It is cataloged. It is technically open to the public, but almost no one asks to see it. Of the roughly 140 children who entered that building between 1896 and 1907, Helen has been able to trace confirmed life outcomes. A death record, a later census entry, an adoption file, a marriage certificate, anything for fewer than 35. The rest, more than 100 children, exist only as first entries in a water-damaged ledger. A name, an age, a county of origin, and a dash. The Briarfield home was not an anomaly. Between 1870 and 1920, hundreds of similar institutions operated across the United States, many with the explicit approval and financial support of state and county governments. Some were run by people who genuinely wanted to help good-hearted women overwhelmed by too many children and too little money. Others were run by people like Lenora Fry. People who understood with cold clarity that in a system that paid per child and never counted the dead, a child's life had a dollar value, and a child's death had none. Reform came, but it came slowly. Ohio passed mandatory inspection laws for private children's homes in 1911, 3 years after Briarfield closed. Federal standards for child welfare didn't arrive in meaningful form until decades later. By then, the children of the baby farming era were gone, absorbed into the soil, into the silence, into the blank spaces of institutional records that were never designed to remember them. Look at this photograph one more time. A father who couldn't work. A mother who couldn't say no to a man who arrived at her door with a clipboard and the authority of the county behind him. 2 older children who grew up and never mentioned their youngest sibling, because they were told not to, or because the silence became the family's way of carrying what it could not undo. And a baby whose eyes were carved out of the only image that ever proved it had been held. Clara Pardee couldn't bury her child. She was never given a body. She was never given a grave. She was never given a name to put on a stone or a date to mark the end. So she buried the photograph instead. She sealed it in the wall of her home like a prayer spoken into darkness, not to be answered, but to be remembered. A small tin box pressed between 2 wooden studs, covered over with plaster and lath, hidden from everyone, even from herself. And for 120 years, no one heard it. Until someone tore open the wall. If Clara could know that someone finally opened that wall, that someone found the photograph, and the note, and the lock of hair, and that someone spent months learning her child's name and telling this story. What would you want to tell her? Leave your answer in the comments.